Russian spy ship today tried to pick up parts of an underwater Poseidon missile launcher moments after it had been fired from an American submarine. The incident took place 30 miles out in the Atlantic off the Cape Kennedy Space Center. An American destroyer, a support ship carrying reporters and cameramen, and a Russian electronic surveillance ship were on the surface. Below was the nuclear submarine James Madison. The Madison fired one of the new Poseidon multiple warhead missiles, and the launch was successful. When a Poseidon missile is fired, it leaves segments of its launch tube floating on the water. Suddenly, the Russian spy ship increased its speed, and the Russian crewmen tried to pick up the debris in the water. They failed. At one point, the Russian ship was on a collision course with the American support vessel, but the Russian ship veered away, and the Americans picked up the debris. The stuff is not classified for security reasons, but the incident is likely to be the topic of a lot of inter-office memos in Washington and Moscow.
There are numerous reports here in Washington and in Southeast Asia that American airplanes in Cambodia are flying in combat in close support of Cambodian ground troops. A Cambodian officer, for one, described these flights in detail and said they'd been going on for more than a week. The U.S. command in Saigon said it had no information about that. At the Pentagon, the public answer to this is that American airstrikes are directed only at communist supply lines moving through Cambodia toward South Vietnam. But American correspondents in Cambodia have seen U.S. Air Force planes flying in support of the Cambodians. But again, the U.S. military insists they're bombing only to cut supply lines leading to Vietnam.
The South Vietnamese government has pressed into operation 300 sampans, wooden barges, and houseboats to carry 5,000 refugees from Cambodia down the Mekong River to Can Tho in the South Vietnamese Delta. The flotilla consisted of 4 groups of boats, each group being towed by a tug. Military ships were also along for protection, since last Tuesday, a ship carrying refugees from Phnom Penh was attacked by the communists. President Thieu has set a deadline of August 15th for the repatriation of all the refugees still in Cambodia. The situation in the refugee camps in Phnom Penh is getting worse by the day. Sanitary conditions are bad, food is scarce, and relations between the refugees and the Cambodian government is becoming strained. This is why President Thieu has ordered the removal of the refugees as soon as possible. Most of these people say they've lived in Cambodia all of their lives. They're being driven out now by the war. Cambodian officials say they can't tell the loyal Vietnamese from the communists, so they put them all in camps. But the real reason for the refugee problem is that these people have been historical enemies for centuries. These people are back in Vietnam now, but they're going to find that their troubles are not over. 90,000 of these refugees are coming from Cambodia into Vietnam, and the Saigon government just doesn't have the facilities to cope with them all. They're going to find that they're just going from one refugee camp to another. This is Lou Davis, NBC News, on the Mekong River with the refugee flotilla.
David Bruce, the new American negotiator in Paris, arrived there today to take over the peace talks with North Vietnam and the Viet Cong. He will go to this week's session on Thursday. He said today the president had given him broad latitude to try for some kind of agreement. John?
In the effort to stop the shooting in the Middle East, it was a tough day for everybody concerned. Israel is going through the worst crisis since the 1967 war. It still looks as though the right-wing Gahal party will leave the coalition government. Arab leaders are meeting in several capitals trying to heal the breach in Arab unity caused when Egypt and Jordan accepted the American plan for a ceasefire. In Cairo, the newspaper El Ahram wrote today, strangely, those who speak about a ceasefire are those doing the fighting, while those who clamor against it are those who've done no fighting except with words. At the United Nations today, some of the key players in the drama got together. Secretary of State Rogers was in town, along with UN Secretary General U Thant and the Swedish diplomat who was doing the actual talking to both sides, Dr. Gunnar Jarring. They met for an hour and a half, and Rogers said later the time had come for quiet diplomacy. The commander of the Russian Air Force is in Egypt, and he is believed to be touring the missile sites near the canal. His visit may also have something to do with unconfirmed reports that 2 Russian pilots were shot down in Egypt last week. The Israelis admit to the loss of 1 plane over the canal today, while the Egyptians claim 2. In Tel Aviv, government figures show that Israel has lost 26 planes since the '67 war, 5 of them in the last month.
The Israeli people are, for the most part, behind this peace initiative. At the same time, they're deeply suspicious and skeptical. In Tel Aviv, they're concerned that the price of peace may be the return of all occupied territories, which would place this city once again within range of Arab artillery. Most people consider that price too high. And, in fact, opinion is completely divided as to whether this peace effort can possibly get anywhere.
There's a lot of talking on both sides, but it doesn't look like it, because let's say that President Nasser says one thing for foreign policy and another thing for home consumption, I would say.
I think that we should give the chance to the possibility of stopping the fighting and to give a little humanitarian thoughts to let the war stop, and the time to make things better.
One thing does work to the advantage of the American proposal, the nagging worry that it may be the last chance, and that if it fails, the ultimate alternative is war. David Burrington, NBC News, Tel Aviv.
On his way back to Washington from San Clemente today, President Nixon stopped in Denver to talk to a meeting of law enforcement officials, and then he called a news conference where he charged the news media tend to glorify and to make heroes out of criminals. Reading from notes he had in his hand, he said, unless this glorification of those obstructing justice is stopped, the system will break down. And then the president made the flat statement that Charles Manson, who is on trial for his life in Los Angeles, is guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders. A few minutes later, his press secretary called back and said he was retracting the president's statement because he had failed in referring to Manson, failed to use the word alleged. But by then, the trial in Los Angeles had been thrown into a small uproar.
When the president arrived at the Federal Building in Denver, he was again welcomed by a friendly crowd. He was using the meeting with the law enforcement officials to nudge Congress to move forward with his anti-crime proposals. He spoke to reporters just before the meeting. That's when he made his comment about Manson.
I think the main concern that I have is the attitudes that are created among many of our younger people, and also perhaps older people as well, in which they tend to glorify and to make heroes out of those who engage in criminal activities. This is not done intentionally by the press. It is not done intentionally by radio and television, I know. It is done perhaps because people want to read or see that kind of story. I noted, for example, the coverage of the Charles Manson case when I was in Los Angeles. Front page every day in the papers. It usually got a couple of minutes in the evening news. Here is a man who was guilty, directly or indirectly, of 8 murders without reason. Here is a man yet who, as far as the coverage was concerned, appeared to be rather a glamorous figure.
Shortly after the president spoke, his news secretary, Ronald Ziegler, gathered reporters together to try to change what the president said about Manson. There was no intent, said Ziegler, to impute liability to any accused. In other words, Ziegler was trying to say that the president did not mean to prejudge Manson. After an uncomfortable few minutes for Ziegler, it became clear the White House knew that the president, usually so precise about language, had slipped. The consequences of his misstatement as yet are unknown. Herbert Kaplow, NBC News, with the president in Denver.
In theory, the comments of the president should have no effect on the 7 men and 5 women who are the jury here in the Manson trial. They are locked up each night after the trial in a hotel room, and they have been forbidden to either watch, read, or listen to any news reports concerning the trial. However, it is not outside the realm of possibility that one or more jurors could somehow find out about the president's remarks, for instance, when they are allowed visits by their relatives over weekends. Word of the presidential statement caused a stir in the courthouse and a hurried conference between the judge and all attorneys, but there was nothing said in open court. Prosecutor Vincent Bugliosi said the president's remarks will have no consequence because the jury is locked up. But one defense attorney said he'll probably ask for a mistrial. Another indicated that he'll ask the charges against Manson and 3 of his girl followers be dismissed for prejudice. A third defense attorney, Paul Fitzgerald, said the president's remarks were, in his estimation, shocking, unbelievable, and un-American. The judge said he wanted to see the president's statements before entertaining any motions. Don Oliver, NBC News, Los Angeles.
2 states, Oregon and Texas, have appealed to the Supreme Court, charging the new law giving the vote to 18-year-olds is unconstitutional. The Constitution gives the states the right to set the qualifications for voters. When this law was passed, many members of Congress and the President had the same doubts, but they thought they should leave it to the courts to settle. John?
In Ohio, Governor James Rhodes has ordered a special grand jury investigation of the disorders at Kent State University which resulted in the deaths of 4 students. This will be one of several inquiries into the Kent State troubles. The Ohio National Guard has made a study, as has the FBI.
In Ravenna, Portage County Prosecutor Ronald Kane said he was relieved now that the state of Ohio apparently has been spurred into convening a special grand jury to investigate the Kent State disorder. Kane said he was upset by the many conflicting accounts of the events and believes only a grand jury can impartially sort them out.
I'm a little bit disappointed in that I am of the opinion there has been too much rumor in circulation, which has, as a result, developed around the Kent State University incident. The only proper place that any of these reports, these fact-finding reports, should be submitted would be to the grand jury. It's for the grand jury only to fairly and impartially, and I want to impress this on you, to fairly and impartially investigate the situation at Kent State University, and then after their investigation to return whatever indictments they themselves felt necessary to return. It's not for me to predetermine, nor any other organization, governmental organization, to predetermine or cast aspersions as to whom is guilty.
A special federal task force is now on the Kent State campus securing witnesses to present to the Presidential Commission on Campus Disorders when it arrives at the university later this month. Fred DeBrine, NBC News, Ravenna, Ohio.
Senator Gaylord Nelson of Wisconsin introduced an amendment to prohibit the sale of internal combustion engines after 1975. If it passed, that would give the automobile industry 5 years to come up with some other kind of engine, steam, electric, or something that would not pollute the air. He also advocated a resolution without the force of law, urging the automobile industry to stop spending all the money on annual restyling of the cars until the pollution problems are solved. He said, until we face this problem, the automobile, we cannot say we are serious about air pollution. And in Tokyo,
For a few hours Sunday, Tokyo's main shopping districts became pedestrians' paradises. In what in effect amounted to a counterattack against automobiles, the city banned vehicular traffic from 4 downtown areas. Tokyo's air pollution situation has reached a critical level over the past few weeks. Storekeepers who had at first opposed the idea of the ban on automobiles finally threw themselves enthusiastically into the project. On Tokyo's famed Ginza, they provided potted plants, colorful umbrellas, and music.
Oh, when the sun's gonna get longer, it don't be very much color in that road. Come speed back home.
More than twice as many shoppers turned out than normally come on a regular Sunday. The holiday promenade lasted only between 1 and 6 p.m., but it's scheduled to be repeated on a regular basis every Sunday and holiday from now on.
This is John Rich, NBC News, Tokyo.
Representative Vigorito of Pennsylvania put in a bill to make it illegal to sell soft drinks or beer in throwaway bottles and cans because there's nowhere to throw them. It would require them all to be sold in bottles and the bottles carried back to the stores. It probably would eliminate, for one thing, the sale of imported beer, since hauling empties back to Europe would be prohibitive unless they shipped it here in barrels and bottled it here. We asked the congressman, and he said it would apply only to beer and soft drinks, not to bean cans, pickle jars, ketchup bottles, and so on. But with the cities running out of room to dump trash, there is no assurance they will not be next. Chet?
No, it's not. Hurricane Celia hit the Texas coast near Corpus Christi this afternoon, a smallish but very dangerous storm. Winds of 140 miles an hour are being recorded, and the storm seems to have picked up strength in the last few hours. Thousands of people have been evacuated, tides are running 10 feet above normal, house trailers were thrown in the air, and the police have closed the downtown section of Corpus Christi because the glass in store windows is likely to be blown out. The death toll in the sinking of a ferry boat in the West Indies between Nevis and St. Kitts is now estimated at 125 people. This is where the steel-hulled ferry boat Christina capsized and sank with its captain aboard in azure, clear, and dangerous waters. 88 passengers were rescued and taken to the hospital in Charlestown on the island of Nevis. The dead were brought here too, and for a long while, many islanders didn't know the fate of their relatives. The Christina had been licensed to carry 180 passengers, but it is said that she was carrying 250 when she began to list. When that happened, the passengers all ran to one side of the boat, which capsized and sank in 5 minutes. The government in Nevis owned the boat, and there will be an investigation. In the meantime, authorities declared yesterday an official day of mourning. The Army is preparing to transport 12,500 nerve gas rockets from Anniston, Alabama and Lexington, Kentucky to Sunny Point, North Carolina, and then dump them at sea on the 16th of August, 282 miles east of Cape Kennedy. Today, Army Undersecretary Thaddeus Beale told a House subcommittee that the gas rockets are deteriorating and that they'd better be dumped in a hurry. The National Academy of Sciences recommended the dumping in water 3 miles deep as the least undesirable solution to the problem. And the Academy said the rockets ultimately would leak as seawater got through their concrete covers, that a certain amount of marine life would be killed, but that eventually, it didn't say when, the action of seawater on the gas would cause it to lose the ability to poison anything.
The Food and Drug Administration says a bug killer made by Shell and called a no-pest strip is unsafe to use near food. It puts out a vapor the FDA says is dangerous. It's a paper affair hung from the ceiling, apparently the successor to the old-fashioned flypaper. Unsightly, no doubt, but it cost 10 cents and it hurt nothing but bugs. Modern progress is such, the FDA says this new item is dangerous to humans, and it costs $1.98. And in Boston,
the aircraft carrier John F. Kennedy made its first visit to the late president's home territory. About 20 members of the family were flown in by helicopter to tour the giant ship. Among them was Mrs. Ethel Kennedy and her children. Mrs. Joan Kennedy was there too. Caroline Kennedy, daughter of the president, was making her second visit to the carrier. 3 years ago, she christened the ship before its launching. Senator Edward Kennedy of Massachusetts joined the party. Mrs. Jacqueline Onassis, the president's widow, did not go aboard. The John F. Kennedy, weighing 80,000 tons, is the largest conventionally powered warship in the world. It was named after President Kennedy upon the recommendation of President Lyndon Johnson. Today, the Kennedys toured the flight deck and then the wardrooms. It was very much a family reunion. This is Liz Trotta, NBC News, reporting.
The owners and players in the National Football League settled their financial differences. The strike is over, and the players now will report for work, and the 1970 season is saved, if it ever was in any danger. Guerrillas in Uruguay still hold 2 diplomats they kidnapped, and the Uruguayan government refuses to negotiate with them, and there's no word on what happens next. The federal government figures and reported to Congress today, poor families still have more children than self-supporting families, even though preventing one unwanted birth would save a family almost $8,000, or save the government that much if they are on welfare. The foreign ministers of West Germany and the Soviet Union met again in Moscow today, and a German source said they had made progress toward a non-aggression treaty. The stock markets had fairly sizable losses today. The Dow Jones Industrials fell more than 11 points, and on the New York Exchange, an average share lost 42 cents. On the American, an average share lost 10 cents. John?
Thank you. Last week, this program described how the people of Maud, Kentucky slashed through some red tape and solved a problem in an unusual instance of get up and go. And now we have some film of their project. Maud is a sleepy town of fewer than 100 people. The nearest shopping center is in Bloomfield on Highway 55 across the Beach Fork River. But the state closed a bridge on Highway 55 for repairs and refused to build a temporary bridge, which would have cost $17,000. So the people of Maud built their own for $563. They're proud of it, but one farmer said it's not necessary. Thank you and good night for NBC News.
Produced by NBC News, which is solely responsible for its content.